Hi everyone, this is our first video on mediation analysis. First of, I believe, 5 videos that we'll have. We'll start off with some basics and definitions, and then there'll be some exercises and quizzes for you in the tutorial. First of all, what exactly is mediation? Mediation addresses the causal mechanisms that underlie a relationship between a predictor and an outcome variable. Example from my own work, we ask questions like, okay, we know intergroup contact relates to reduced prejudice toward other groups. However, why does it relate to it? What is the mechanism that underlies that? One idea is that contact reduces prejudice by first reducing feelings of anxiety that people feel when interacting with people of different races or ethnicities. And then in turn, intergroup anxiety, the reduction of intergroup anxiety relates to less prejudice. So in this example, the intergroup anxiety would be the mediating mechanism between the relationship, for the relationship between intergroup contact and prejudice. Although most literature that you read on mediation will refer to causes, it's important to recognize that cause and causal relationships are only appropriately concluded when the research design affords those conclusions. In general, if it isn't longitudinal, if it isn't experimental, you can't really talk about causes. A lot of mediation stuff and a lot of the stuff that I do relies on cross-sectional analyses, basically correlational work. You can apply these sorts of tests to those data, but it does not establish causal mediation. For this reason, a lot of people prefer the term indirect effect rather than mediated effect, because oftentimes people think of mediation as implying something causal when it doesn't necessarily do so. Indirect just refers to the statistical test for the presence of an effect. Some classic graphical representations here. Note in the handout that we have, I've made a note about some of the labeling being a little bit confusing on the figure. But the part here isn't the confusing part. There's 2 parts to this graph, a top part A and a bottom part B. Capital A, capital B. I wish they'd use something else here because that can be a little bit confusing. So I'm talking about the top of the figure where X is leading to Y. That represents simply the relationship between a predictor and an outcome. In the example that we've been using, X would be intergroup contact, Y would be prejudice. The little path there between the two, that on top of the arrow, is labeled C. C is termed the total effect. That's how much of a relationship there is between between X and Y, how much a relationship, in this case, there is between contact and prejudice. That is basically a correlation. It's an unstandardized version of a correlation or unstandardized coefficient, but it's basically whether how strongly the 2 variables are related. Another way to think about this is that this is going to be Y predicted by X without anything else in the equation. So this would be a simple linear regression in this case. The bottom part of the graph that's labeled B, that has 3 variables in it. It's got X, intergroup contact in our example, and Y again, which is prejudice. M in this case is intergroup anxiety. M stands for mediator. There's a handful of paths here. The path C prime is termed the direct effect. That's how well X is explaining Y once the mediator is entered in the regression equation. Basically, this is just multiple regression with 2 predictors predicting Y. So C prime is what's called the direct effect, and you can see that arrow goes directly from X to Y. The path A is the mediator predicted by the predictor. It's how strongly the 2 variables are related to each other. And then M is how strongly the mediator predicts the dependent variable with X in the equation. The last piece here, and this isn't necessarily shown in the graph, but it is what we're really after. Not shown in the graph is what's called the indirect or the mediated effect. The indirect effect is represented in a couple of different ways. One way to calculate it is simply by taking the path C, the total effect, minus C prime, the direct effect. That is, what was your coefficient before the mediator was entered, and you just had X as your only predictor? What was the coefficient afterwards? The difference between those is how much the relationship between x and y is reduced once the mediator enters the equation. So that's one way to get that, is to simply do subtraction. Another way to get this, interestingly, is to multiply the A and the B paths together. That relationship C minus C prime, how much the effect changes, is simply a function of how strongly the predictor relates to the mediator and how strongly the mediator relates to the outcome, Y. And you can think of AB as how the path from X to Y that has to go through M. And that's why it's sometimes called the indirect effect. You can see that we go from X to M and then from M to Y. That's how much of the effect of X is carried by the mediator, how much is explained by the mediator. And again, that's often called the indirect effect, whereas down below, C prime, that's called the direct effect. We've got a direct arrow from X going to Y. All right, a few additional issues. Mediators versus moderators. The two words kind of sound similar, and they are sometimes commonly confused. Moderation refers to an interaction effect. An interaction effect is not a mediated effect. For example, if we were talking about an interaction, we might have something like this. The relationship between quality of intergroup contact and prejudice would be weaker for people who have fewer contact experiences than it is for those who have more contact experiences. So that's an interaction. You're getting a different effect for different levels of the number of contact experiences. As contact experiences go up, people who have more favorable interaction and more favorable contact experiences will then have not only more favorable contact experiences, but more contact experiences that will have a stronger effect on prejudice than would it be for somebody who has very little contact and doesn't have very high quality contact, doesn't have many good contact experiences. So again, that's an interaction effect. Moderation refers to interactions. Mediation, what you're always looking for there is when you're thinking about a process occurring, intergroup contact reduces feelings of anxiety, which then reduce prejudice. That's what mediation is getting at. It's getting at a process happening rather than it be an effect being stronger at certain levels of one of the predictors. What we won't cover in this section, but what's become very popular, are what are called conditional processes. That is mediation processes that differ for different conditions. This is also called moderated mediation. It combines both interactions and mediation effects. Again, we're not going to get into covering that, but that is another extension of this material. All right, I'll stop here and in the next set of slides, we'll get into single variable examples and calculations.